we've come now to what we might call the very heart of the Christian message. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. And we know that Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea exactly from the years 26 to 36 AD. Sometime during that 10-year period of Pilate's governance, Jesus Christ was put to death. It's a datable event. A few years ago, archaeologists were uncovering some materials at Caesarea Philippi where Pontius Pilate had a palace. And they uncovered there a column with some Latin letters inscribed. And when the dust had cleared away and they could see what it said, there were the words, Pontius Pilatus, Pontius Pilate, a name in stone, a character in history, under whom Jesus Christ, the Son of God, suffered and died.
One of the other amazing statements in the Apostles' Creed is that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate.
The creed moves straight on from his birth of Mary to the fact that he suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead and buried.
The creed passes over his life.
It says nothing about his ministry on earth.
The miracles that he performed, for example, they're all recorded for us in the Gospels.
I once read a book by a Baptist theologian its title I liked very much, which said, "We are saved by his life." And what he's trying to do is to remind us that before the crucifixion, people are already being saved by Jesus. He tells a Syrian woman, he tells a centurion, he tells people he heals, he raises Lazarus, he does all these things. He's saving all along.
But the creed doesn't refer to them because
It moves straight towards his death.
It's not that his life is totally unimportant or anything like that, but that the really significant thing about what he came to do was his death and everything at the end.
And has that extraordinary phrase, suffered under Pontius Pilate.
The Creed stresses that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate.
It's interesting that the Creed singles out Pontius Pilate by name.
Don't you think it's remarkable that Pontius Pilate, that Roman governor, should find a place in a Christian creed recited centuries later?
How strange it is and how bizarre that we have a second-rate Roman provincial governor in the Christian creed, so that every time that I say the creed in church, I mention this man, Pontius Pilate, who actually not many people even in the first century had heard of, and how come he's got there?
God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and Mary. We're talking about the Apostles' Creed. We're talking about the most noble concepts we have. And in the middle of it, we have a two-bit Roman governor named Pontius Pilate. The greatest theologian, to my taste, of the 20th century, Karl Barth, always says, here you are at a banquet, and in comes a mutt, kind of a dirty dog. It's beautiful that he's there.
This is the only time in the Creed that we make a reference to a human person who is in fact known to us from the pages of secular history. Outside the Gospels, the New Testament, we can find in various texts in the ancient world references to the fact that Pontius Pilate was the governor of Palestine at the time when Christ died.
Suddenly we realize that the whole thing is anchored in a historical event.
That indicates that our Christian faith is a historical faith.
We're dealing with history here. We're not dealing with fiction, fairy tale. Real people in real time.
This is not just a legend or a myth. This is history. This really happened.
Jesus was real. He died on a cross. Pontius Pilate is a governor. And the records of his governorship can be found. I mean, they have come down to us.
That we can place it in a geography and a history, in a place and time.
This sets the death of Jesus in its history.
Christianity, different from many of the other religions and different from being merely another ism. There are plenty of philosophers in the world and plenty of philosophies that people have shaped around a set of ideas, trying to grapple with the meaning and significance of our world. But Christianity is different and unique. It draws on its Jewish roots. It's from the same family of faiths, and the Jews believed very strongly to the fact that God wasn't just an idea, and he wasn't just there somewhere in the universe, but he stepped into the world and made a difference. So the great events of the Jewish nation were that he delivered them from oppression in Egypt, that an exodus took place. And that was a historic event to which they could look back and repeat and teach their children. Not a myth, but an actual event. And that same trajectory takes place and leads us to Jesus, that God doesn't just give us in our minds an idea that he loves us or that he can save us, but he actually shows us in human form, in history, in a place, in culture, that he's sent his son to do something about our problem and to give us a way out of our dilemma, to grant us salvation and the forgiveness of sins. And he does that in the person of his son. And Jesus is a person with a date in history. We say that he died under Pontius Pilate, and on the third day he rose again. Those are facts at the basis of our faith that puts our faith in an altogether different category from many of the isms in the world.
Pontius Pilate anchors this story very specifically in the history of first century Judea.
The necessity of emphasizing the historical, physical, earthly, human existence of God in Christ was focal. And this was another way to do it. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, because Pontius Pilate was the procurator under whom Jesus was crucified, and even Roman sources give us that information.
That is very important. The real humanity and historicity of Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate.
Pontius Pilate is a person of whose existence we have other evidence.
We know about Pilate from Roman sources, and particularly from the Jewish historian called Josephus, who tells us a very great deal about the period of Jesus and so on. And we know from those sources that Pilate was not a very good governor, not a very good politician. He was a bit of a bully. And like many bullies, he was a weak man at heart, so he could be pulled and pushed this way and that, and then when he thought things were getting out of hand, he would lash out.
He seems to have been not a particularly successful governor, and we might guess that from the account in the Gospels, his hesitations and indecisiveness.
We're in the midst of a mob scene. We have a governor here who doesn't know what authority he has or anything like that. He's kind of a skullduggery type, not high ethics. He's clearly, it's above his head. He's lost it all. He sort of wants to buy peace.
Coming out before the people. Jesus has come out and he's sentenced him to death, releasing him to the mob. He's going to be scourged and then crucified, and Pilate seeks to wash his hands in water. But all the water in the world could not wash those hands clean. But one drop of the blood of the hands of Jesus on that cross could have done the job.
And so Pilate is a way both of earthing the story, this really happened, and we know when it happened. It happened in the late 20s or early 30s of the 1st century AD in Palestine, in Jerusalem, but also of saying Jesus did the classic thing of going into the vortex where political power was doing its worst. Pilate was simply the cat's paw of this massive system called the Roman Empire, which crushed everything that got in its way and sent out lesser people like Pilate to do the dirty work.
None of us today living would have ever heard of Pontius Pilate were it not for the fact that for an important hour or so of his life he was up against Jesus Christ. So Pontius Pilate takes his place in history, and he now gets into the creed, the only other person who's mentioned in the creed. That has made him the second best known person in the whole of history, only for the fact that he was with Jesus for about an hour. All around the world, people say, crucified under Pontius Pilate.
And so many people in the world today, when they say the creed, face similar situations where political and social forces are squashing them and grinding them, and it is a huge comfort for them to believe and know that Jesus himself was in that place where the great empire, through one of its little local henchmen, had actually been responsible for his death. So it's both a historical memory and a very powerful impetus for people to identify with that today.
Very interesting that the Creed says he suffered under Pontius Pilate. It says he died, but it first says he suffered.
The fact that Jesus suffered is a very significant point.
Suffering is part of our experience mostly. Very few people get through life without experiencing suffering to one degree or another, of one kind or another. And one of the big questions that faces us perpetually is how to understand suffering and how to react to suffering. So there are any number who would say it's purely an illusion, that it's not reality. People do that in the Hindu faith, they do that in Christian Science, a whole range of philosophies which would take you down that road. But when you're suffering, you know it's real, and that's not a satisfactory explanation to our human experience. A certain strain of Puritanism might suggest that, well, that's it, we're in this vale of tears and we can't do anything different, and so we just put up with it. That actually goes back to a Greek philosophy called Stoicism. And yet here is this amazing and different approach that says Jesus Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate.
One of the truly odd things about Christianity is that it focuses on the suffering of the central figure and his dying.
If we go to the Gospels, all four deal at some length with the last hours of Jesus. The suffering was intense. He suffered as probably no other person has ever suffered.
I don't think the important thing is how badly he suffered. It's who's doing the suffering. I have spoken on this subject at a chapel a few feet away from a huge hospital. And it occurs to me some people lying there with cancer are suffering, absolute agony for many days, and maybe hurt as much as what it hurt for his crucifixion for those hours. But who they are and who I am when we die, we're not representative. For him, the whole weight of the story of God's dealing with us comes to bear.
There was physical suffering, but there was more. There was mental suffering. There was spiritual suffering.
It's true that he suffered in a number of ways through his life, an amazing number of ways that relate to the ways in which you and I suffer today.
Every pain and suffering that humans feel, Christ also experienced.
From the very beginning, Christ is suffering because, as the Gospel of John says, the world cannot see. So he's enveloped in the darkness of the world, and he suffers throughout his life.
There in his very early days, there was the slur of his birth being an illegitimate birth.
From the very beginning as an infant, where there's no place for him to be born, he has to flee the country.
He's, in those early days, taken as a young baby down into Egypt as a refugee. He's a displaced person. In his public ministry, he's harassed by the Pharisees.
He's not considered a prophet in his own land.
He shares in the suffering of poverty without having a home of his own or a place to lay his head.
He's often rejected.
He's ridiculed and subject to rumor and misunderstanding.
He lived the life of suffering.
But climaxes, of course, in the suffering that you see recorded in the Garden of Gethsemane, and you witness as he is flogged and then crucified in exquisite form of inflicting pain. And all his civil, all his judicial, all his human, all his rights are violated.
In the prophecy of Isaiah it is said, "Surely he has borne our grief and carried our sorrow." We need to say, all our grief, all our sorrow he has carried.
Perhaps the best known stories of human tragic death in all of world literature, certainly Western literature, are the death of Socrates and the death of Jesus. Socrates, the great philosophical teacher, who went to his death because he maintained his innocence when the court wanted to convict him of teaching stuff that was corrupting the youth. And then Jesus, of course, went to his death in a rather different way, but equally on a charge of, among other things, false teaching. But Socrates lay on his deathbed, drank the hemlock, which was the poison that he had officially to drink, discoursed to his friends about the meaning of life, the meaning of death, and philosophy, and so on, and died very peacefully while they were all broken-hearted and so on. But he maintained a kind of noble composure to the end. Jesus, interestingly, is very, very different when we see him particularly in the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane.
The night before he dies, he prays a prayer he taught us to pray, "Thy will be done." What I notice is many people say that's the best prayer there is, but as I listened to him, they were sort of saying, well, God, I wanted my way, you wanted your way, and you're bigger than I am, so you win. I'm throwing in the towel. Thy will be done. That's not what Jesus does. He says, thy will be done, and then he keeps on praying. 3 times he does that. And I think what we're getting here is the sense that he's in constant communication with the one he calls Abba, Father.
According to Luke's Gospel, he actually sweated drops of blood. Now that has been studied medically, and it has been demonstrated that some people under intense emotional pressure and threat actually can and do sweat blood, and it looked as though that's preserving a real historical memory, which tells you that Jesus was under the most appalling emotional pressure. He knew what crucifixion meant. It meant slow, very, very unpleasant torture of the entire body, where every nerve and part of the body was being tortured simultaneously. And that was exceedingly nasty, and anyone in their right mind would shrink from it. So that even though Jesus has been absolutely clear that he has to go to Jerusalem and do this, when the moment comes, he says to the Father, isn't there another way? Have I misunderstood? Could we not do this differently somehow? And he wrestles in prayer until he settles it in his mind that, no, this is the way it has to be. I've often said to people, if you go to Jerusalem, you'll see the Garden of Gethsemane is at the bottom of the Kidron Valley, on the east side of the great mount where the temple is, and on the west side of the Mount of Olives. Now, Jesus and his friends had been going night by night to Bethany, which is up on the Mount of Olives, and staying there, then coming back into the city. Now, if Jesus had wanted, he could have gone on from Gethsemane up to Bethany, and then they could have slipped away to the east. He could have been across the Jordan by morning, and the guards would never have found him. He'd have been able to escape. He didn't have to go through it. The question is, why did he stay in Gethsemane, despite the fact that he knew what was coming? And what we see in Gethsemane is Jesus as a fully 100% human being. Jesus is not a demigod pretending to be human. Jesus is not saying, oh, well, it'll be nasty in a way, but then I'm divine, so who cares, and in 3 days it'll be all right. He's not beginning to say anything like that. It's an act of extraordinary faith and obedience to his vocation that he goes to his death in the way that he does.
Of course, the suffering began in Gethsemane when he wrestled that evening before, and then it reached its climax on the cross.
In the Gospels, we read of the crowds around Jesus on the day of the crucifixion, and they shouted abuse at him, "Come down and save yourself." But instead, he stayed there, and he saved us instead.
There's the other side to it, and that is the spiritual suffering.
The ultimate suffering is a spiritual suffering.
His physical pain was very great.
He is agony. He is in pain on this cross.
But his mental and spiritual anguish and agony were surely greater.
He enters fully into the suffering. Mark even goes so far as to record that cry of anguish, my God, why have you forsaken me?" when he's on the cross.
The cry, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" is a spiritual suffering.
The words, "Why have you forsaken me?" are far more challenging than the words, "I thirst."
To feel that God has forsaken him, the Son of God, with the ultimate purpose, the ultimate Savior, the messianic entry into history, to feel that he is forsaken by God is the ultimate spiritual suffering.
Just as in Gethsemane, he is struggling to go on believing that the one he calls Abba, Father, really does want him to do this crazy thing. I mean, see, other people said he was mad. His friends said he was mad. His mother and his brothers said he was mad. It must have crossed his mind that maybe he was, actually. I think anyone in his position would be bound to say, am I deluded? Am I chasing a dream? Have I been silly all this time? After all, everybody knew it's failed messiahs who end up on crosses, not successful messiahs. And so when Jesus is then hanging on the cross, and his enemies around the foot of the cross saying, yeah, you are going to destroy the temple. You think you're the Messiah. Well, now prove it. Come down from the cross. There must have been some part of his mind and his imagination which must have said, you know, they might just be right. And then the question is, what does Jesus' vocation do with that question? And the answer is it goes back to the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, you find a prayer of one who feels like that, who thinks like that, but who holds on to that thought in the presence of God. And what is that prayer? We call it Psalm 22.
He uttered the words from Psalm 22, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?
My God, why did you abandon me?
Christ was not just quoting the Psalms. He meant every word that he said.
So he suffers the desolation of separation from the Father with whom he'd been so intimate and walked so closely.
That cry is the ultimate human cry.
Part of our human experience into which Christ enters is the experience of desolation, loneliness, and even despair.
Human beings also undergo the suffering that they feel abandoned by God. That's why it occurs in Psalm 22. But the cry of that on the cross is evidence of the humanity of Christ. It's evident of the plan that God had for the crucifixion and for the redemption. And it is evidence of the spiritual suffering of Christ on the cross.
Here is the mystery of cruciform love, that the holy God, in the depths of love, enters so completely into our unholiness, into our deadness, that in some unfathomable way, God is separated from God's self. I can't explain this. I don't think anyone can explain this. This is mystery. But it's the mystery of cruciform love. Of a God who, in a sense, abandons himself for us.
He who is God himself and never ceases to be God, yet knows what it is like as a human to be cut off from God, to feel utter alienation and isolation.
Obviously, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one God and in that sense can't be separated. But Jesus, as the Word made flesh, had this sense of separation, of forsakenness by God. He experienced that on our part also, although at a deeper level. He still was the second person of the Trinity, the Son, the Word made flesh. In his experience, he went through the separation, the forsakenness by God, which we deserved.
I led a retreat last summer with some doctors, and we were asking, what's the worst? Is it pain or aloneness? All the doctors said aloneness is worst. People can endure all kinds of pain if they don't feel God has abandoned them, if they feel their relatives are praying for them. Being alone is the terrible thing. And for that moment, Jesus asks, what has happened? Am I being abandoned?
And he shares the pain of a world that has lost God. He shares the anguish of those who have lost hope. He suffers with them.
When he cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Here he plumbs the depths of human experience.
And to every Christian, that is a sign that he really suffers as a human in the midst of all this.
He is united with us
The cry of abandonment of Christ on the cross is one that resonates with the human sufferer. And it has resonated with the human sufferer throughout the Christian tradition. In fact, when Calvin preached on Job, all of Job's pains, all of the things taken away from Job, nothing was as bad for Job as the feeling that God had abandoned him. That was the ultimate temptation for Job, according to Calvin, is that Job had been abandoned by God. Now, this occurs in contemporary literature, in Graham Greene's The Heart of the Matter. Scobie is in the church, and he wants to commit suicide. He's at a moment of despair. And yet, he hears Christ say to him, how can you take your life? How can you commit suicide? When I have died for you, I have claimed you, you cannot take yourself away. And despair is a very important point here, because spiritual despair, the feel that you are beyond the reach of God, either because God has turned away from you or the fear that you have turned away so far from God that nobody cares, including God. The fear that God can't reach you or won't reach you is spiritual despair. And that spiritual despair is answered by the cross, that God never forsakes you, that God can reach you no matter how deep and far he has to reach. One of the ways Luther expressed this that I like the best is that the creation from nothing becomes the way God acts in every human life. That we come to a point of spiritual nothingness. We come to a point of utter despair. And just as God created the world out of this nothingness, he will bring us back out of this nothingness and make us a child of God. So that no matter how deep you fall, no matter how far away you feel, no matter how much despair and emptiness is in you, God's power is greater than that despair. And God's assurance and promise on that cross is a guarantee, is an assurance that that despair is not ultimate and that God will not and cannot forsake you.
The ultimate in human experience has been endured by Jesus already on my behalf.
So these words on the cross enable us to say to someone who is suffering and in despair, Christ knows what you are suffering. He knows it not only as God, God knows all things, but he knows it also as man. He knows it in a human way because he, in his human experience, also underwent despair.
Today, we often identify suffering with modern things such as anxiety about the future, how we're going to die, are we going to die alone, are we going to die in a painful death, all sorts of issues, meaninglessness, etc., that define in contemporary terms much of what human beings suffer. In the Bible, that would be considered the consequences of sin. Okay, that we experience those kinds of anxieties and those kinds of sorrows and suffering because we are turned away from God, because we are sinful. And that sin that causes these anxieties and these fears are what that sin is taken on by Christ on the cross and defeated. So that on the cross, the human Christ suffered. There is, when you see a crucifix, not a cross, but a crucifix, many of these crucifixes, particularly starting in the 15th century, is the agony of Christ on that cross. This is not a serene death. This is not a death where I'm God, so I'm just going to be stoic and not feel anything on the cross. Christ suffered as he suffered in life, he suffered on the cross. And he suffered because of human sin. It's very important to recognize that on the one hand, his suffering unites us Christ with us because we suffer, but he's also suffering because of us, because of our sin. So on the one hand, Christ is a sufferer, just as human beings are a sufferer, but Christ doesn't deserve to suffer because Christ is without sin. But nonetheless, because he took on our humanity, he took on our sin, and therefore he truly suffered throughout his life and on the cross for us because of our sin. And in so doing, he eradicates or he defeats the cause of the things that we suffer from and the manifestations of our suffering in meaninglessness, anxieties, death, etc.
There's a quote from C.S. Lewis which I like very much, which sums up this. It's from the book called The Screwtape Letters, which, as many will know, is a set of fictional letters, obviously, written from a senior devil to a junior devil. Screwtape is the senior devil, Wormwood is the junior devil. And Screwtape says in one of these letters, he says, "Wormwood, make no mistake, our cause, that is the devil's cause, is never more in danger than when a human being, believing himself to be abandoned by God, looks out on a world from which every trace of God seems to have vanished, asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys." Now, Lewis is applying that, of course, generally to anyone, but obviously it's modelled on Jesus. And that's what's going on, that Jesus takes his sense of God-forsakenness into the presence of God by means of that psalm.
In saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I believe he is expressing the fact that he is bearing at that point our sin, and that his Father, a holy God, is so pure that he cannot even look on evil. So as the sin bearer, at that moment, he's separated from his Father. The eternal bond is not broken. Indeed, on the third day, the eternal bond is gloriously restored for all to see in the resurrection. But at that moment, there must be that separation as he bears the darkness of sin.
Furthermore, when Jesus cries, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" This is also a part of the meaning of death. That when Christ died, although he did not have to, he submitted to the power of death. Spiritual death is God forsaking me, is the abandonment of God. That is what spiritual death is. And in the devotional context, where this story is read and this story is meditated on and preached, it's important to recognize that just as Christ defeated physical death, Christ defeated spiritual death. So that when Christ felt forsaken, he defeated any notion that we are forsaken. We are not forsaken by God, and the story